So someone under my last Wicked video literally commented and said that the movie and the musical are basically fanfiction. And oh my gosh, you are so right. Like, it's actually crazy. The movie is like if somebody read the Spark Notes, but they didn't actually fully read it. And so then they had AI summarize the Spark Notes and add in some extra fun twists, while also, making it a hell of a lot less dark. I just finished the school portion and it's not even close. And don't get me wrong, the movie is great, but the book is so good. It's actually a bit depressing because, oh my gosh. So let me tell you about what actually happened in the book. Spoilers, if you want to read the book, if you don't like spoilers, then leave, get out. The rest of you buckle up. First off, Madame Morrible did not have a relationship with Elphaba, did not like Elphaba, did not even want Elphaba to attend the school. Also, Nessa Rose was younger than Elphaba. Elphaba went at a regular age, and so Nessa Rose wasn't even there when she was first admitted into the school. Second of all, the first half of the schooling, all of the kids were separated via gender. So there were actually 2 different schools, and the boys and girls had nothing to do with one another because of rampant sexism. Also, Glinda in the book is a lot smarter than Glinda in the movie so far. Glinda in the movie seems almost vapid. Like, it is like pulling teeth trying to get her to be a regular person. But you actually see inside Glinda's brain, from her perspective, for a whole hour and a half long chapter. And the girl has some deep thought processes. Secondly, Glinda wasn't actually chasing boys at all. Did not want really to have anything to do with them because of how strict the differences between the sexes were viewed. And so if she did interact with a boy, then it was with her Alma, which was her minder, which they all of the girls that were living in their separate dorms had to have a woman living with them to keep them in check. So basically all of the more poor girls were stuck in big dormitories, and then all of the ones who had an Alma or had a caretaker were allowed to have their own independent dormitories with 2 girls per room. As I mentioned last time, Elphaba was actually born to a traveling union preacher, and so she was not well off, and actually people vehemently disliked her family. The only reason that she ended up in the room with Glinda is that Glinda's Alma had actually gotten hurt on the way there, and so Glinda was like, well, I'm still going, and she was like, okay, and so Glinda was gonna wind up in a room with everybody else, but she did not want that, and so she went and she begged the woman at the top and was like, please, Madame Morrible, please let me have my own room, and she made up a lie about her Alma, and how she's a little bit wrong in the head or whatever, which comes back later. And then Madame Morrible was like, fine, take Elphaba, and Elphaba was like, oh, okay. Next up, I know that they did this for cinematic purposes, but Elphaba is never actually described as wearing anything black. Gray, tan, red, but never black. A version of the hat scene in The Room does take place, which is why I'm saying again that it feels like AI would just read off there was a hat scene, and they were like, oh yeah, let's go with that. So Glinda was trying to bond with her, and she was like, here, try on this hat. And she thought that it was going to look bad, but it actually apparently looked really, really good on Elphaba. And it wasn't a black hat, it was a yellow hat. And it had one of those little curtains that kind of hangs down, a veil that kind of hides her face a little bit. And she was like, oh my gosh, you're actually beautiful. And she meant it. And then she kept the hat. There was no hat scene other than this. Next, the goat professor was really, really, really important. Elphaba was doing research with him to figure out what the difference was between animals and animals. So animals with a capital A versus animals with a lowercase a. The ones that are conscious versus the ones that are kind of like the animals we know in our world. They wanted to scientifically prove why it was that animals deserved rights. Something else very noteworthy is that they had to determine their majors after their first year, and Elphaba decided to go with life sciences. She did not go with sorcery. She didn't even like sorcery. She didn't even take any sorcery classes. She thought it was dumb. Glinda, on the other hand, was actually recommended to take sorcery by Madame Morrible. She told Glinda to do it, and she actually likes Glinda. She actually was her confidant. A big scene did happen at the end of their first year involving the goat and involving late Madame Morrible, because Madame Morrible was doing a poetry night, and all the boys and all the girls were allowed to come and participate as long as their almas could come and watch them. Madame Morrible read a poem that she had wrote, and at the end of the poem it said, animals should be seen and not heard. Professor Goat was there, and he was not happy about this, and he was like, did you hear that? That's ridiculous, and then he was escorted out. Elphaba was trying to talk to Glinda about this, and Glinda was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you're talking to me in public, and then she made her shut up and leave. Which brings us to Boq. Boq was not a minor character, and Boq was actually basically Elphaba's best friend. We found out that Boq had actually known Elphaba when she was a kid over in Munchkinland. Elphaba didn't remember this, but Boq did. He's the one who coins the term Miss Elfie. He has a huge crush on Glinda, but Glinda will not give him the time of day because Glinda is basically racist against him because he's a Munchkinlander. Glinda is a tall person, so in her world, she needs to marry a banker. Apparently. Bok and Glinda do have one kiss, but nothing else comes from it. But because of his crush with Glinda, he does become best friends with Elfie because he wants to get closer to Glinda. And in doing that, he's like, oh man, Elfie's actually really cool. And so he and his friends end up helping Elfie by getting the documents that Professor Goat needs from the male library because he's not allowed in the library and Elphaba's not allowed in the library because of sexism and racism, but the boys are. With the help of Bok and Elphaba, like, Professor Goat is making some really, really good discoveries. Apparently, word of his discoveries got out to somebody, and that somebody was Madame Morrible. So, Madame Morrible, in the dead of night, had him... It was pretty gruesomely described, too. Fortunately, unfortunately, probably unfortunately, their Alma saw something weird happening in Professor Goat's office, and she's like, oh, I'm gonna go check that out. So she went to go check it out. So unfortunately, she saw the schmurder, and Madame Morrible is like, no, I can't have any witnesses. And so she made her go crazy. How did she make her go crazy? With magic. Remember how I mentioned that this imaginary illness that Glinda had come up with that her Alma Clark had? Somehow, the Alma, after this night, fell ill with that sickness that didn't exist beforehand. And she had only told Madame Morrible about. Listen, y'all, Madame Morrible is scary. But life goes on, they continue with their studies, and at this point, the racism against animals has gotten a lot worse. And so they had originally had a bunch of animal professors that were teaching them over at Shiz University, but they were no longer allowed to teach. What that meant is that they lost a lot of professors, and so both of the schools were allowed to conjoin for this year for the first time ever because the animals were being so mistreated, i.e. they weren't allowed to teach anymore. The day that the Alma dies, she kind of snaps out of her craziness for a little bit, just long enough to tell Elphaba and Glinda that, yes, it was Madame Morrible, it was her servant that went in the goat. As if there was any question. Which is when Nessa Rose enters the scene, because they no longer have an Alma in order to watch them, and you have to have an Alma if you're a girl and you're living in a separate dormitory. And so her nanny, which again, remember, I told y'all, the nanny was actually a human, and this is an important part of the story. If Nanny hadn't been a human, then she wouldn't have been allowed to be their stand-in Alma, but since she is a human, she was allowed to. Nanny shows up with Nessa Rose. And Nessa Rose, I know why they changed this, but Nessa Rose was not in a wheelchair. Nessa Rose didn't have arms. She had no arms. And this is actually a pretty important part of the story because it shows again the dehumanizing of people that are different. Because Madame Morrible was literally like, I do not want this girl to come here, and basically Elphaba just forced her hand. The reason that the fact that she doesn't have arms is so important in this specific world that they have built in the book is that basically the only difference between animals and humans is that they don't have appendages, they don't have hands. Like the goat couldn't read the books himself, he couldn't write down his thoughts himself because there wasn't like any way to dictate it onto like a computer or whatever, and so they were seen as less than because they lacked those human qualities. Someone who doesn't have hands faces the same issues as a sentient goat in this world, which is why Madame Morrible did not want her there. Nessa Rose is uber religious just like her dad, and so she's her dad's favorite. He even sends her a gift in the mail and does not send anything for Elphaba, and it's the ruby slippers, and she makes Elphaba put the slippers on herself. And Elphaba looks kind of upset because she didn't get a present, and Nessa Rose is like, oh, don't ruin this for me, I need this and you don't. The other big scene that's important from the school time is the scene with the lion cub. Y'all, the invention wasn't a cage. The invention was a lobotomy. This man almost lobotomized this baby in front of a whole class. Elphaba spoke up at this and argued about it. However, 2 other girls that had no part in the story were the ones who took the lion away, and there were 6 people who were protesting. There was no Poppy scene, because once again, Elphaba did not even have magic at this point. Or if she did, she didn't know that she did, and she thought it was dumb. The book is fascinating, and I cannot wait to see what happens next.